everyone. My name is Sarah Tynan, and I am a geographer. I graduated from CU Boulder with my doctorate in political geography last year. My research is about the Uyghur people. I lived in the region for 2 years, conducting ethnographic fieldwork. And today we have come together for awareness of this issue through fact-based evidence reporting on the issue. What we are seeing today is one of the largest human rights crises since World War II. So, thank you everyone for being here. I do want to thank our sponsors. First, the Center for Asian Studies was the main sponsor for this event. And I have their flyers for their luncheon series. For their luncheon series right back here. So if you're interested in their other events, please do check them out. Our other sponsors were the Anthropology Department, the Geography Department, the Islamic Center of Boulder, and the Uyghur Human Rights Project. If you want more information about the Uyghur Human Rights Project, we have their information right here on this board. I did want to say that today's presentation, we will only tolerate civil and respectful conversations. We do have a zero tolerance policy for disrespectful interruptions, but we do encourage dialogue between people who have different opinions. So today, first, we will welcome our speaker from Washington, D.C., Mustafa Aksu, who is a representative of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, who will be speaking first. And second, we will welcome Dr. Darren Byler, who is a postdoctoral research with the Center for Asian Studies here at CU Boulder, partnering with Professor Tim Oakes on the China Made project. Finally, I will conclude with some action steps on what you can do to help. Is Erica here? Okay, we might have a representative from Congressman Joe Negus's office, who will also be talking about the role of the U.S. government in this issue. And finally, we will end with a Q&A. And after that, we will have a reception with some food to further the conversation with each other. Finally, this event is being recorded. We will only video record the speakers here on the stage. So even if you ask a question, we will not record your face. So if you are a little bit nervous about that for various reasons, we totally understand. We will not be recording the audience. Erica has just come in, so we will have a representative from Joe Negus's office a little bit later. But the event is being recorded, so if you want to see it online later, or if you want to share it with your friends, that will be available later. Okay, without further ado, so I am going to pass around this clipboard. So if you can just go ahead and sign in. This helps with the Center for Asian Studies statistics and data on who is attending their events, and also allows them to know that you're interested in issues around Asian studies, and it helps with their recording purposes as well. So I'd like to welcome Mustafa Aksu, who will be sharing his expertise and personal experiences.
Hürmetlik hanımlar, efendiler, yaxşımısınızlar. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It feels so great to greet you all in the beautiful Uyghur language in a place where I don't have to be afraid of criticism for speaking my native language in public. And I'm really honored and privileged to be here today. Thank you for the kind introduction, Sarah. And thank you all for taking time to attend this event from near and far to show your support for the Uyghurs. And I also noticed that there are some Han Chinese friends among the audience, and I want you to be aware that my presentation is not about targeting you and China as a whole country, but I will talk about the Chinese Communist Party's policy in the region. Many years ago, faced with the horrors perpetrated by Nazi regime, our predecessors said, never again. Unfortunately, never again is happening right now in my beautiful homeland. As a close relative of some of the victims of the Chinese Communist Party's brutal policies in the region, I have been invited to speak up and share my stories at various occasions at universities, churches, synagogues, mosques, and middle schools here in the United States. And I'm aware what I have to say today is a bit depressing and sensitive issue, but I hope one day will come soon when I don't have to deliver speeches like this about the Uyghur plight, because I hope and I believe that by that time, my people will be free to enjoy their rights as human beings given by Almighty God. And so today, using my own experience as well as my interactions with camp survivors and also reporters who recently came back from the region, I will briefly present the current situation of Uyghurs and the region with you. And I hope some of you will take what you learned home with you and spread the word. First of all, let's look at the map of China, and the area in red color is where I was born and raised. The current official name of this region is Uyghur Autonomous Region. It means new frontier, new territory, and the Uyghurs in diaspora prefer to call it East Turkestan. So during my presentation today, I will be using East Turkestan, Uyghur Autonomous Region, province, and the Uyghur region in different contexts. As you can see from the map, also borders Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, and Russia, and some other Central Asian countries. According to the Statistical Yearbook of Chinese government in 2016, the total population of Uyghur is more than 11 million. However, the Uyghurs have, we think there should be more than 12 million, and some of the organizations, they claim that there are more than 20 million or 35 million Uyghurs, and honestly, we don't have the clear answer to that question.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. So now we will have Dr. Darren Byler, who spent a total of 24 months in the region, more time in China as a whole, and he wrote his dissertation about this. He's also written several articles about this issue, so welcome Darren to the stage.
Hi everyone, it's a real honor to be here. That was a really moving talk from you, Mustafa. So what I'm going to do for the next 10-15 minutes is talk about some of the reasons why this is taking place and how it's taking place and what its broader effects are, some of the structural issues that are behind this. And to start, we need to understand that until the 1990s, the Uyghurs were the majority in their space, in their homeland. They were more than 90% of the population. I was talking to Mustafa earlier today, and he said that when he was growing up, if a Han person came into their village, into their neighborhood, everyone would run outside and they'd look at that person because it was so unusual to see a Han person. In the 90s and 2000s, that began to change, and that was because there was large numbers of people moving to the West as part of an Open Up the West campaign. It was sponsored by the state, and it was aimed at getting at natural resources that were in this region. And so when those people arrived, they began to build out the harder infrastructure in the south part of the region. Sorry. I can't see it. I'll use the mouse here. So down in this area, that's the Uyghur majority areas. They began to build the pipelines, the roads, the railroads that they would need to access the natural resources that are there. Because around 20% of Chinese oil reserves are in this place, in this space, and 20 or so percent of natural gas is here as well. And today around 84% of Chinese cotton comes from this region. And so when the people arrived in the 90s, they began to develop those infrastructure to extract those resources and also build out the sort of industrial scale agriculture. So these are huge cotton fields. And this had a dramatic effect on the Uyghur population. Primarily what it did is it caused the cost of living to begin to rise. Uyghurs were mostly excluded from those new economies. They weren't working in the natural resource sector. And in some cases, they became a kind of tenant farmers in the cotton business. They also, in the 2000s, began to cultivate tomatoes. And so today, around 25% of the world's tomatoes comes from this region. So you can see that there's a lot of natural resources, that this is really important to the nation as a whole. But that you can also see that the Uyghurs are excluded from aspects of this. And that's why they began to feel dispossessed. They began to feel as though they were losing their land, losing their way of life, and that they were having a difficult time entering into that new economy. Along with the harder infrastructure of roads and all of those things, the Chinese state also began to develop communications infrastructure. And so in the 2000s, the Uyghur villages came onto the electrical grid. TV became available in people's homes. And then in 2010, a new development came along, which was 3G networks, internet accessibility. And so in 2011, when I did my first year of field work, I saw lots and lots of young men and people in general buying smartphones. These are cheap sort of Android devices, many of them manufactured in China. And people could get a SIM card and put some minutes on that SIM card, and they could communicate really easily on the smartphone. One of the things that smartphones did for Uyghurs was it gave them greater access to technology, because prior to this, Uyghurs had a varying degree of computer literacy. They didn't have access to computers, but the smartphone is really intuitive, so you can figure it out really quickly. And in 2011, a new app called WeChat came online, which really transformed how they communicated. So the good thing about WeChat is it allows for oral speech to be used to communicate with each other. And so Uyghurs didn't have to type into the device, because that was one of the difficulties. There wasn't a keyboard that they could use. So everyone could speak, everyone could use this, and so by 2012, 2013, everyone had WeChat, or it seemed that way. Grandmas and grandpas had it, the children had it, everyone had an account. The other thing that was special about WeChat and oral speech was that it was very difficult for the government to police it. They couldn't really fully assess what Uyghurs were saying in Uyghur language in using oral speech. They just didn't have the tools to censor it. And so Uyghurs could talk fairly freely about politics, about religion. They began to link up with Uyghurs that were living abroad, living in the United Arab Emirates or living in Turkey. And they began to follow religious teachers that were based in other places to some extent. Primarily, though, they used the internet and WeChat as a tool to find jobs. And so in 2011, 12, 13, and 14, we started to see large numbers of people moving to urban locations to find jobs. And this was not only caused by WeChat, but it facilitated it in some ways, because they had a community that they could join when they got to the city. When I did my second year of fieldwork in 2014, this is what the Friday prayers looked like at the local mosques. There was more people that wanted to pray than could fit inside. And most of these people were migrants, people that came from rural areas to the city. They said they came to the city for religious freedom, because in the rural areas, everyone was in each other's business, and everyone knew if someone was going to the mosque or not. They said in the city, there's more anonymity, and so you can go to the mosque and no one seems to care. At the same time, though, they did know that these spaces were surveilled, and so they said that the mosque was not the space of quote-unquote real Islam, that real Islam happened on the internet. It happened on WeChat. It happened in prayer rooms that are around the mosque area. Many people were sharing teachings on SD cards or using Bluetooth technology, an app called Kwaya, which is like AirDrop for iPhones. It allows you to transfer files between phones. They were listening to these messages and talking about them. Mostly what they were interested in was just mainstream forms of Islam, Hanafi school of Islam. What does it mean to be a Muslim today? What is halal? What is haram? How should we live our lives? Those were the kinds of questions they were asking. They weren't primarily interested in political forms of Islam. They did, however, begin to change how they appeared in significant ways. Many young men that were coming to the city began to dress in more pious ways. They grew beards, or they simply went to the mosque 5 times a day. Women, in some cases, began to veil themselves. And at the same time, in 2014, there were an increase in violent incidents between Uyghurs and the state. There had been violent incidents for some time. Often it's about land rights issues, or an imam being taken from a mosque, about someone's brother or uncle being arrested arbitrarily on the street and not really having any sort of due process. So there was a lot of protests that often became violent. And then in some cases, in 2013 and 14, there were some attacks on civilians by Uyghurs, both in the Uyghur region and in other parts of China. And this really alarmed the state. So they had these two things. They had Uyghurs that were looking a bit more religious in their appearance, and they also had these violent incidents. And like many governments in the world, they began to... Closer?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's better.
Okay. They began to correlate these two. They said, oh, if you're dressing this way, you must be interested in violent extremism. And so they began what they called a de-extremification campaign in 2014. And that's what this looks like. It's posters that were placed everywhere in the Uyghur neighborhoods that said, it's no longer permitted for Uyghurs to dress this way. You should instead look like beautiful people. And we already began to see people begin to disappear into camps that were being built, or they were actually usually schools that were just being transformed into prison spaces. But it was a small in scale at first. That began to change, as Mustafa said, in 2016 and 17, when they began to really implement this de-extremification campaign on a much larger scale. Some of this had to do with technology, and that's what I'm going to focus on for much of the rest of this talk. It had to do with listening to those messages on your smartphone. That was one of the signs of extremism. Being part of a WeChat group, having a VPN, installing WhatsApp, watching TV shows where people look Muslim, having any materials with Arabic lettering. Those were all signs of potential extremism. And they were developing tools that could detect these things in people's phones and computers. People's digital footprint, the things they had been doing in the last several years, suddenly were being used against them. So there's actually a whole security industry that's sprung up around this that began after 2014 or even before that, but really developed these tools just in the last 5 years. It's targeting a group of people because they look different and they practice their faith, and they also are in a space that the market and the state really wants access to. So Uyghurs are being labeled extremists or terrorists, and that is producing a kind of state of exception where the normal rules no longer apply, and so people can be treated differently than regular citizens. So civil rights and human rights are being suspended. It's also productive. So from the technology development side, they see themselves building predictive products that can be marketed to other people, other spaces, and other countries. And they're also most recently producing forms of coercive labor. So the main actors in this security system are state security, police, higher education, research institutes, and private industry, private tech firms. And the goal initially was to break the Uyghur autonomy when it came to internet use. There's 1,400 tech firms in the region, $7.2 billion were invested in projects related to surveillance. in 2017 and 2018. And these are three of the tools that are really the key tools that are being used. One of them is this device here, which is plugged into your phone or your computer and recovers data that you've tried to delete on your phone. You can tell if you've installed WhatsApp and all of those things that they're trying to detect. Another tool is one that focuses on speech, that enables the auto-transcription and translation and assessment of Uyghur speech. Remember, they're using WeChat and the oral speech function, so that's no longer an option for Uyghurs. And they're also developing tools that will automate the detection of Uyghur faces based on the kind of racial phenotypes of their face, which is very difficult because Uyghurs look very different. And so they said they have about a 30% success rate, a lot of false positives. But that's the kind of thing that they're thinking about, is how can we detect Uyghurs and control them? When you go to the region, as I did most recently in 2018, you see convenience police stations every 200 to 300 meters. And these are surveillance hubs. They're banks of computer screens or monitors that are flashing different sorts of squares on people's face. Like green squares, yellow squares, red squares. And if you get a red square, that means that this person should be investigated, and so police can go out and talk to that person. They also are responsible for a grid, and that's what you see here. So a certain neighborhood is their responsibility. As you move from grid to grid, you go through a jurisdictional boundary. You go through a biometric checkpoint where you have your face scanned and matched to the image on your ID. The system is supported by a really unprecedented data collection called Physicals for All, which is something that was run out of police stations and mobile clinics throughout the region. They asked everyone to go to the local space and submit their DNA, their fingerprints, blood types, and also to read something several times into a device to get a unique voice signature for each person. And in many cases, they scan their eyes, their irises, and in some cases, their faces. And the scan of a face means that they take pictures from all sides. They ask you to hold your head up and down and make different expressions on your face. They had over 100% participation in this, which speaks to the way that it was done coercively. The former detainees that I've interviewed said that they were forced to do this. They said, if you don't go and submit your data, you will be sent to the camp. In addition, they sent people into their homes to do these qualitative interviews and assessments that Mustafa talked about. Over 1 million people have been sent to camps. 3,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 people 500,000 people have been sent to prison in addition to the camps. This is one of the largest camps. It's close to Urumqi. It's since doubled in size and has the capacity, an estimated capacity of 130,000 people. These are not schools. Like Mustafa said, initially the state said that they didn't exist, and then they said they do exist and that they're great. They said they're training centers or vocational training schools or centers. But we can see from the state bid contracts that they're being run as prisons. And we also have a manual that was written by one of the key leaders in the region that says it as well. There's surveillance systems. These are actually kinds of smart camps. They have face recognition enabled software in the camera systems. Razor wire stun guns, electric batons, handcuffs. All of the former detainees I've interviewed said that the guards always had a non-lethal weapon on them, either a club or a stunning device. The camps themselves are run like medium security prisons, which means that it's dormitory-style cells with about 10 to 30 people in each cell. If it's a large number of people, they often have to share a bunk, like they sleep head to toe so they don't talk to each other. They never turn off the lights. All the detainees remarked on that. They said that the lights are turned on especially brighter than in here, and that the cameras were looking at their faces. That if they covered their face with their hand or they put a blanket over their hand, over their face to try to get more sleep, that they would hear something from the speaker system, a guard telling them, stop covering your face. Which leads us to assume or believe that there's some automation happening in how the surveillance is working in the camp. In 2018, we started to see transfers of detainees to other camps. We also started to see factories being built adjacent to camps. And we started to hear reports of people being transferred into the camp, into factory spaces adjacent to the camp. Most of the work that's being done is in the garment industry. 84% of Chinese cotton is sourced in this region, which makes a lot of sense from a state perspective that you'd want to just source the production there as well. And so the state plans to move 1 million jobs in cotton production there by 2023. This has to do with the rising labor costs in eastern China. So there's also jobs already going to Vietnam and Bangladesh, and now they have this new population of workers in Xinjiang that can do some of the labor, and so they can keep it inside the country. To really wrap up quickly here, Gulzira Alkun, who's one of the people I interviewed in January in Kazakhstan, who spent a year in a camp. She was guilty of watching Turkish TV and traveling to Kazakhstan. She was in this camp for a year and then was finally released, and she thought maybe it's over. Then 3 or 4 days later, the local authority in her village said, now you're going to go work in this factory. This was a factory that she went to work at. It's just several kilometers from the camp that she was held for the year before. The manager of the factory is this man, Wang Xinghua. She said she met him actually in the camp prior to being sent to the factory, and it seemed as though he was like selecting workers to go work in his factory. He talks about this as a poverty alleviation effort, that he's providing jobs to Uyghurs. He said by the end of 2018, they'll have 2,000 new workers, and that they're generated $6 million in sales in 2018. At the same time, they didn't pay Gulzira much of anything. They paid her 300 yuan, which is $50 for a month, and in addition, a penny and a half per each pair of gloves that they made. So this is way below the minimum wage in all of China, and especially in Xinjiang. It's a kind of coercive labor. All right, to wrap this up, from the state and from security industry perspective, what's being produced through this system is a kind of permanent stability. If we wanted to talk about a final solution, this is what they're thinking about. They're thinking about no more incidents of violence and a subject population that's very productive, and that the camps themselves can become a carrier of the economy. That's the kind of language that they're using. And they also talk about how they can develop these tools that they're using to surveil and manage Uyghurs and market them to other nations. They said the Belt and Road itself, which is the big development initiative, has 60% of the world's Muslim population, and so there's unlimited market potential. The broader implications of all of this is that it's calling into question human agency and social autonomy itself. It's a new form of colonization, a new form of control that seems to not have an outside. And I think it's really important for all of us to think about what's happening to the Uyghurs as probably the first instance of this kind of control, and one that could be replicated in other places, and something that all of us should be concerned with. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. So some of you might be thinking to yourself, okay, what can I do to help? So Justin is going to be handing out a handout on some steps you can take to make a difference. One thing that you can do is read news articles that you see about this issue. News outlets, this microphone is terrible. News outlets, actually, they count the number of clicks that they get on each article, and they count how many shares they are getting. Okay, I understand we don't want to perpetuate and replicate this terrible system, but at the same time, we do want the media to continue to focus on this issue. So every news article you read, it helps give the news outlets a reason to keep publishing on this issue. And every share that you give can help encourage that too. You can also follow the issue on these accounts that I have up here right now. So feel free to take out your phone at this time and take a picture of this slide, or go ahead and add these accounts to your social media platform and share share their publications. These social media platforms are ones that are grassroots organized, are locally produced and funded, and I think they're a great way to get more information on the issue. The next thing you can do is either boycott or write letters to companies that are associated with the Xinjiang crisis. For more information on these brands, you can read the report Uyghurs for Sale by the think tank ASPI. These are just some of the brands that were implicated in the report. And I know that many of us shop at these stores. I know I myself have clothes from H&M, so I understand that sometimes these brands are unavoidable. But it is something that we can think about. Think about the source of the cotton, and if that cotton is coming from Xinjiang, and we do know that these stores are supplying cotton from Xinjiang. The next thing you can do is call your senators. So again, go ahead and take out your phone, take a picture of this slide, or put the senators in your contact list right now. So the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, it was actually already passed by the US Congress, but it is waiting to be ratified a second time by the US Senate. This bill will put sanctions on leadership and businesses that are associated with Xinjiang, as well as put a mandate on the US State Department to investigate human rights issues in Xinjiang. So this is a huge deal. And right now it is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. So if you could call Cory Gardner and Michael Bennett and tell them to pressure Mitch to get this bill moving along. It's Bill S-178. If you would like more information on the bill, I do have a handout. With more information. So please do feel free to come up and ask me about it later, or you can do some of your own research on it as well. Finally, on a more personal note, this is a picture of Rahila Daoud, and she is an internationally renowned folklore scholar and anthropologist. She was a colleague of mine when I worked in Xinjiang, and she helped me a lot. Her daughter contacted me in November of last year and asked me to help her with an international campaign to pressure the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government to pressure China to release her mom from prison. Why? Because she is a famous scholar. She does have this kind of known presence for the Chinese government as a cultural preservation activist. So I do encourage you to go to freemymom.org. You can sign a petition. There's social media outreach that you can do there, as well as a letter that you can print and sign and mail, or you can email. But I also have a letter with me here today that you can sign. So I was informed, I actually didn't know this, but I was informed, and Erica, oh my God, this is terrible. Hello. So maybe Erica can tell us more about this, but my colleague told me that, because I was writing letters directly to the U.S. Department of State, and my colleague told me that actually it's more effective if you get your representative to advocate to the U.S. Department of State on your behalf. So we do have a letter addressed to Representative Joe Magoo's today that you can sign, and I will bring it to his office later next week, or whenever Erica has time to meet with me. So I do encourage you to sign that letter. So we will be advocating for Ryla's release, pending her release, at least knowing her location and allowing her access to her family and allowing her access to fair and free legal counsel. You can read that letter. I'll have it, and I'll have a place where you can sign. And then I'll bring that to Representative Nagoos, and we'll see if he can then pressure the U.S. State Department. So with that note, I am going to invite Erica, who is a representative from Joe Negus's office, and she's going to talk a little bit about what Joe Negus has already done on this issue and what their office does provide in terms of advocacy, especially for immigrants and refugees.
Hi everybody, I wanted to thank everybody that's already spoken about this extremely important issue and just introduce myself and our office. My name is Erica and I work for Congressman Joe Negus, who represents 2nd Congressional District, including Boulder, in the U.S. House of Representatives. And due to the advocacy of Sarah and others, he did sign on to it was the House version of what Sarah just talked about, and in support of human rights for Uyghurs. And also, I believe I saw Brother Hadi a minute ago, but he has also been lobbied to sign on to a House resolution in support of people in Kashmir, and he's also just recently co-sponsored that. So I would encourage all of you to keep using your voice to talk to my boss about things that you'd like him to do in the U.S. Congress. And I would love to meet with all of you that want to talk about this. And then just a little bit more about what we do in the office is I'm the immigration constituent advocate. So that means if anybody that lives in our district is waiting for a visa, naturalization, DACA renewal, anything immigration related, I'm able to make a congressional inquiry on their behalf. And so I'm trying to get the word out that we do this. It's a free service and it's something that sometimes does really move people's applications more quickly through the process. And so I have some lit here that I'll leave if there's some place that Sarah wants me to leave it for people. And just come and visit us and keep the line of communication open with Representative Negus and make sure to ask him for things that you'd like him to be doing in the U.S. Congress. Thank you.
First off, I want to thank both of you guys for all the work that you do on this issue. I think it's clear that it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. So thank you guys for that.
Closer to your mouth, please.
Okay, sorry. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. So this question, I think, is more so directed at Dr. Violet because it's security related, but Mr. Aksu, you're welcome to answer it as well. So you touched on the main justification that the CCP has given for their policies being counter-extremism. And a big part of those, their claims to having significant counter-extremism problems in East Turkestan is their designation of a group called East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM, as a terrorist organization. And that was soon given credence when the US and the UN followed suit and designated them as such. And some reputable scholars have provided some compelling evidence that questions whether this group even exists at all. So my question is, do you believe that this group is real? And if you do you think that they pose the threat to China's territorial integrity that the CCP claims they do?
Right. That's a great question. So ETIM, or ETIP as it was called in the past, was based in Pakistan for the most part. And from what scholars that have looked closely at this have found is that it was really a handful of people, really a public relations department, one or two people that were posting videos and things like that in the 90s and into the 2000s. So it really had very little connection to people actually in China. Most Uyghurs I spoke to had never heard of it, and of course searching for them online was something that was illegal, so they would never look. So my sense is that it really was not a threat to the Chinese state. In the 2015, 16, 17, when ISIS began to move in Syria, and some Uyghurs moved from Turkey down to Syria to fight against ISIS, that began to alarm the Chinese state. And in some cases, people that are now in Syria, Uyghurs in Syria, are saying that they're part of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. It's also, but they're not actually connected to the earlier version of East Turkestan Islamic movement. So it's not really a viable organization and really doesn't project real power anywhere in the world as far as we've seen. It's important to disaggregate East Turkestan Islamic movement from East Turkestan itself. Because East Turkestan is a historical republic that the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others set up in the 1930s, 1940s, that was recognized, internationally recognized by other governments as a republic. And when most Uyghurs say East Turkestan, that's what they're referring to. They're talking about their own homeland. And if you add an East Turkestan Islamic movement, then you're just adding the Islam to that movement. And most people don't see that as terrorism or related to terrorism. It's just about a feeling of belonging to that space and a feeling of a rightful form of sovereignty that they feel over that space.
Okay, yeah, can we get any more questions? And keep the microphone close to your mouth. That microphone.
Is this good? Can everybody hear? First off, I just want to thank you all for coming and speaking about this extremely important issue. One thing that I have found on this campus, just through my interactions with fellow undergrads, is particularly from my friends of mine that are from mainland China, that when I bring up this topic, they say that it is propaganda from the West, and it's just this immediate pushback, and no matter what links that I send or what I say, it doesn't seem to change this idea that, oh, this is fake news. What, in your opinion, is the best course of action to change the mindset of those that are from mainland China, that maybe do not believe that this is in fact happening, which it obviously is, but what do you guys think is the best course of action to take in that respect?
Thank you for your question. Well, honestly, yeah, I have, every time I give presentation at universities or some places, I have this Chinese audience. I do appreciate they are there, as always. And some of them come and say, I'm really sorry that this happened to your family. And then immediately they say that you are apparently brainwashed by Western propaganda, and you should watch Chinese news more often. And I always thank them. I think most of them have no access to the information, because this is not on the Chinese news. Because in order to know it, you have to go to that region and experience it. I have some friends, and they were in the region, and they sensed that there's like tight security compared to their previous travels. But they don't really have, because most of the Han Chinese, they don't have really interacted with the Uyghurs in the same way Uyghurs don't really interact with Han Chinese. So it's really hard to explain this issue to them. The best thing maybe, there should be more Uyghur activists share their own experience and let Han Chinese friends know this is the issue, it's not about the propaganda. And of course, I highly suggest that there are now so many sources, documents, evidences. They should do more research and learn what happened. Other than that, it is really hard to convince or let them know that this is not propaganda, this is something that's happening right now in the 21st century.
Hello. As we have seen from 2019, we witnessed the amazing leadership of the Gambia to bring the government of Myanmar to the ICC and for their persecution against the Rohingya Muslims. And what we saw is that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation helped fund the whatever needed to be paid in the ICC. So my question is, what has the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the rest of the Muslim world done to protect these peoples if they have done anything at all.
Okay. Honestly, we don't see real actions from those OIC members, Organization of Islamic Countries. Turkey somehow, not at the government level, but citizens protested in front of Chinese embassies, or some non-governmental organization helped the refugees, Uyghurs in Turkey, and helped them financially. And recently, 2 parliament members in Kuwait, they talked about, they raised the issue, they raised concentration camps issue. But other countries, as far as I know, they are very mute. Like countries like Pakistan, they made it very clear that they have this economic incentives from China. They don't want to deal with them, while they are very outspoken on Kashmir issues. Saudi Arabia is they say that it is an internal issue of China, so they respect what Chinese government is doing to the Uyghurs. So it's a shame, and I'm really disappointed. But I believe the citizens of those countries, somehow, I have met many, like here, I met a lot of people from Pakistan. The Pakistan community are very supportive, and they are trying their best to help us on social media and spread the word, but at the government level, yeah.
I'll speak to that too, just very quickly. So, like Mustafa said, we've seen citizen protests in places like Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Turkey, but the governments are not willing to do that, and I think that has something to do with the global standing of China. It's quite different from Myanmar in the sense that the trade relations between these states and China is quite large, and so pushing back against China it's a difficult thing. It takes a lot of political will, and many of these states just don't have that political will. And so that's sort of where we're at. I think there's also, it takes some time to kind of coalesce around this, and hopefully in the future there'll be more sort of consolidation of effort in response. And to speak to the other question about how do you get people to care that are from China, I think we need more Chinese voices speaking to this issue. We need Han people up on a panel like this that can speak to those people in the audience in a different way because they're positioned differently. And it's just very hard to find those people because it takes a huge risk for them to speak in this space. I was encouraged to meet people in Hong Kong that are really thinking in terms of solidarity with Uyghurs. And I think that is something that might move the needle a little bit. Although also in the mainland, people look at Hong Kong as something that they also don't want to support. It's a difficult thing. That's part of the technology that's at work here too, is that there's lots of censorship, there's lots of control over the regime of truth. What's available to be known is very limited by the state.
You were speaking about security as a person in the cyber security area. What is your thoughts on Facebook not wanting to do business in China because they can't trust the Chinese government with like data collection? And then on the same note, ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, acquiring Musical.ly to get a more American audience.
So the first part of the question is about Facebook and why Facebook is not in China. So Facebook was banned in China in 2009, really shortly after there was large-scale violence in Urumqi. And that, I think, was from their perspective because Uyghurs and others were using Facebook to organize social movements, and because Facebook wouldn't allow the Chinese state access to their internal files, it was a space that was outside of their control. WeChat, which does the similar things to WhatsApp, which is also owned by Facebook, kind of replicates some of what Twitter does, some of what Facebook does, but it's all within a Chinese domain. It's owned by a company called Tencent, which by law is required to have kind of full transparency with law enforcement. So if you post something on WeChat, that's now immediately available for law enforcement. Facebook wouldn't allow that transparency in China. Of course, Edward Snowden has let us know that law enforcement here in the US has access to a lot of our data, especially those that are classified as on a watch list, are being watched as potential extremists. And there's a huge linkage between what China is doing and what the US is doing. The Chinese policing theorists actually talk about how they're doing CVE, countering violent extremism, better than the West, better than the US, better than the UK. They're preventing more, they're doing better prevention, and they think that they're leading the field now in CVE, and so that's one of the reasons why they can sell this technology to other places. About ByteDance and TikTok, one of the things that's interesting is that TikTok has partnered directly with a regional government entity in Xinjiang, in the Uyghur region, in Hotan, to propagate what they call positive energy, which is like good stories about what's happening, how like re-education is working, how that so many jobs are being created and things like that. And so in China, Douyin, which is the Chinese version of TikTok, it's doing some of the work of carrying some of this forth, and they're also using surveillance mechanisms to track what people are doing on TikTok, or Douyin. So I kind of missed part of your question about the buying ByteDance, but that's kind of the state of things, and I think we should be careful in using apps like TikTok, although now they've said that they've separated from the parent company or from Douyin, I think, in some ways.
All I was saying about the company buying out was ByteDance vaults musically. If you heard that.
Right. So I'm about at the limit of my knowledge as to like the intricacies of how ByteDance and Musical.ly are connected and what that means, what the implications are. I just think we need to be careful and understand that all of our communication is being tracked. Not just in Chinese tech, but also here in the US, Facebook and Google are tracking us. We should think of our smartphones as tracking devices. And that might be fine for most of us that are protected, that have citizenship status, that are in middle-class positions, that aren't at risk of deportation. But others are really affected in really dramatic ways by these things, and something that all of us should be concerned with.
I just wanted to say one last thing about that. So when I was doing my research in Xinjiang, I worked with a lot of women there. And what I found with the women was that they experienced a very complex pressure, both from their own society and from the Chinese state. So, for example, on the one hand, the Chinese state told them, you can't cover your hair. But on the other hand, their parents told them, you have to cover your hair. And so they were really in a tough situation where they felt what they called bisim, or pressure, stress from all sides. Many, for example, many women wanted to delay marriage, or they wanted to go abroad and study before they got married, or they wanted to get divorced, but they couldn't. They were either forced to get married, or they were not allowed to get divorced, for example. So they felt this kind of pressure to conform to social norms that they didn't necessarily agree with. But at the same time, the government also told them, well, you have to take birth control, or you have to get an abortion. So they were really, they felt, or they told me that they felt sometimes they didn't even have control over their own body in multiple ways. And of course, this wasn't necessarily true, but many spoke of the liberation that they experienced when they were allowed to wear pants instead of a skirt, or when they were allowed to get divorced, for example. So it's actually a very complex narrative, and so there wasn't one perspective. It was, but they did find themselves often experiencing exclusion or marginalization as women in multiple areas of their life.
Yeah, and also I want to add that it depends which part of the region you are from, because Uyghur culture varies from region to region, and some area could be conservative, some area are not. So, and about the marginalizing of the women have no power, no control of their body. Also, they are subjected to government policy. Like I remember that we have relatives work for the family planning office. I met like a lot of women who are about the age of 35 are subjected to this sterilization operation, or if they have extra child that they were forced to abort it. I remember that I saw 8-month-old baby just were thrown into the water and then in front of my eyes, and I was 10 years old. So it's mostly, the pressure comes from the society, Uyghur society itself. Depends like if you are conservative or not, but also mostly also from the Chinese government.